Lost parachutist. I remember that day like it was yesterday. The air was thick, the kind of heavy that makes your lungs ache and your thoughts slow. It was June 6, 1944, and I was far from home, no longer thinking about the quiet life I left behind in the States, but focused only on the mission at hand. I was a paratrooper, Johnny Simmons, part of the 101st Airborne Division, and we were about to make history. Operation Overlord was underway. The Normandy landings were in motion, and our job was to drop behind enemy lines to secure key positions for the invasion. Our C-47 was packed tight with soldiers, gear, and the bitter sin of fear. I wasn't the only one feeling it. You could see it in the eyes of the men around me, even in the ones trying to hide it behind bravado. We had trained for months, but nothing truly prepares you for the reality of combat, especially when you're about to jump into the unknown. The jump was supposed to be textbook, fast, and efficient. But then, of course, nothing ever goes as planned. We had only just crossed the English Channel when it happened. The flak started coming in, sharp and unforgiving. Explosions rocked the plane, shaking it like a leaf in a storm. My heart skipped a beat, then two, as I felt the shudder of metal groaning beneath the pressure. The orders came, get ready to jump. We scrambled for our gear, tightened our harnesses, and made peace with what was coming. The plane was hit hard, and I heard the dreaded screech of metal bending, a sound so unnatural it could drive a man to madness. I didn't need to be told twice. I grabbed the ripcord, leapt into the swirling madness of air, and pulled the cord. The parachute opened with a violent snap, and the world went silent. For a moment, all I could hear was my own breathing and my heart thumping in my chest like a war drum. Below me, I saw flashes of fire and smoke. The ground was coming up fast. Too fast. The wind was relentless as I drifted lower, and for a moment I had a glimpse of my surroundings. The beauty of the French countryside, even in the midst of war, was something out of place. Rolling hills, small villages dotting the landscape, and thick forests that could either be a blessing or a curse. The silence was shattered by a burst of gunfire from below. I pulled my legs up instinctively, barely avoiding a deadly barrage of bullets that would have ended the whole ordeal before it even began. But it was the last thing I saw of that plane. The next moment, my feet hit the ground hard, and I was running. I didn't know where I was, or even if I was anywhere near my squad. The chaos of the jump had scattered us. The Germans were everywhere, their patrols searching for any soldier unlucky enough to end up behind enemy lines. I had no radio, no way to contact anyone, just the echo of a distant battle that raged on in the background. The trees around me were dense, thick with underbrush that tugged at my legs like it wanted to hold me back. I pushed through, trying to keep my bearings, but everything looked the same. The forest was a labyrinth of shadows, and every turn seemed to lead me deeper into unfamiliar terrain. The sounds of the world seemed muffled, the air colder the deeper I went. For days, I had no idea where I was going. I lived off whatever I could find, wild berries, water from streams, and the occasional rabbit or bird I was lucky enough to catch. There were moments when I felt like I was losing myself, slipping into a kind of survival mode that made everything around me blur. But the fear was always there, gnawing at my gut, reminding me that every footstep I took could be my last. It wasn't until the third night that I met them, two French farmers, old enough to be my parents, but with eyes full of a quiet courage that made me wonder how they survived under the weight of the German occupation. I had heard rumors about the French resistance, but I never expected to meet them like this. The man, Henri, had a rifle slung over his shoulder, and the woman, Marie, was carrying a small basket of bread. They looked at me with the kind of suspicion that comes from years of living under the shadow of fear, but they also looked at me with something else, something deeper, something that made them hesitate just long enough for me to get my bearings. Henri didn't speak much, but his eyes did all the talking. He saw my uniform, saw the exhaustion in my face, and made the decision for all of us. He gestured for me to follow him, and without a word, I did. They led me to their small farm, hidden away from the main roads, and for the first time in days, I felt something like relief. But the safety was fleeting. The Germans patrolled the area regularly, and I knew I couldn't stay long. Still, it was here, in the warmth of their modest home, that I learned the truth about the war from those who lived it every day. Henri and Marie told me stories of resistance fighters, of sabotage, of people giving everything to stop the Nazis. They weren't just survivors, they were part of something bigger. It was humbling to be there, knowing that while I was trying to make my way back to my brothers in arms, These people had been fighting for years. They didn't ask me many questions, but they fed me, gave me a place to rest, and kept me hidden from the German patrols. Henri and I would sit in the barn, and he'd tell me stories about his youth, about how he once hoped for a better future before the war came and ruined everything. Marie would watch us from the doorway, her expression unreadable, but the kindness in her eyes was enough. But the war didn't wait for anyone, not even the quiet farmers. One morning, a German patrol came too close. We heard the sound of boots crunching on the gravel outside the house, and I knew our time had run out. Henry's face hardened, and Marie's hands trembled as she passed me a bundle of clothes and a small pack of supplies. "You need to go now," Henri said, his voice low but steady. "We can't protect you any longer." "They're coming." I didn't argue. I couldn't. With one last look at them, at their humble but defiant faces, I slipped into the woods once again, running toward whatever fate awaited me. The forest was no longer just a place of danger. It had become a reminder of what I was fighting for. I had no idea what was coming next, but I couldn't stop now. The mission wasn't over. And neither was the war. The night was colder than usual. The dampness in the air clung to my skin, and every branch I brushed against seemed to reach out like hands trying to hold me back. I had no time to process everything that had just happened. The kindness of Henri and Marie, the realization that the world I had once known was far from the world I now had to survive in. I kept running, each footstep heavier than the last. The adrenaline coursed through me, but it wasn't enough to numb the ache in my legs and the growing sense of dread that gnawed at my chest. I moved silently through the forest, ducking under trees, weaving through the underbrush, my senses on high alert. The crackle of twigs underfoot, the whisper of the wind in the leaves, all of it was amplified in the silence of the night. The moon was a sliver in the sky, casting long shadows across the forest floor, making every turn seem like a possible dead end. I couldn't afford to make a mistake. By the time I reached the outskirts of the woods, I was exhausted. My breath came in ragged gasps, and I could feel the weight of the pack on my shoulders. I hadn't had a real meal in days, and the exhaustion was creeping in. But I knew I couldn't stop. The Germans were still out there, and they were hunting me. For hours, I kept to the shadows, careful not to make a sound. I could hear the distant rumble of German trucks on the road, their engines cutting through the stillness. They were looking for me. I knew it, and I knew I had to keep moving. I'd made it this far, but if I got caught, I wouldn't be so lucky again. I eventually found my way to a small village, one I didn't recognize. The buildings were old, the kind of small stone houses that blended into the landscape. I could see lights flickering in some of the windows, and for a moment I thought of finding somewhere to hide, maybe sneak into one of those houses for a few hours of rest. But then I heard something that froze my blood. A voice, not far off. It was German. The harsh, guttural sound of it made my heart race. I crouched low, hiding in the shadow of a building, listening intently as the voices drew closer. There were at least 2 soldiers, maybe more, searching the area. I held my breath, praying they wouldn't hear my heartbeat or the rustling of my clothes against the stone. The soldiers passed by, their boots thumping on the cobblestone streets. I could see their faces in the dim light, the cold, calculating eyes of men who had long ago abandoned any notion of humanity. But I wasn't their target. Not yet, anyway. They kept moving, their voices drifting away as they searched for whoever had wandered too close to their lines. I waited, counting the seconds, then minutes, until the sounds faded into the distance. My body was stiff from holding still, and my mind was racing. What if they'd seen me? What if they'd heard me? It was a gamble, but I couldn't stay here for long. I needed to move again. By the time the sun started to rise, I had found an old barn at the edge of the village. It wasn't much, but it offered some shelter from the wind and a place to catch my breath. I crawled inside, making sure to check for any signs of German presence. It seemed deserted, and I quickly set up a small camp in the corner. I couldn't risk making a fire, not with the soldiers so close. The cold was biting, but I pulled my jacket tighter and sat down, trying to gather my thoughts. I couldn't help but think about Henri and Marie. They had given me everything they could, and now I was on my own again, running through a land I didn't know. But I couldn't stay there. The Germans would return eventually, and I couldn't afford to be caught. The resistance had helped me, but it was a dangerous game. One wrong move, and everything could fall apart. I tried to rest, but sleep didn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw shadows moving in the corner of my vision. The Germans, the gunfire, the faces of the men I'd left behind. The weight of it all pressed down on me, but I pushed it away. I couldn't afford to be weak. I had a mission, and I had to see it through. The hours passed, and the sky slowly brightened, signaling the start of another day. I had no idea where I was or which direction to take. All I knew was that I had to keep moving. The longer I stayed in one place, the closer the Germans would get. As I left the barn and made my way into the village, I had one goal: to find shelter, to blend in, and to make my way back to the front lines. It was a fool's hope, but it was the only hope I had. I moved carefully, staying low and sticking to the shadows. The village seemed quiet, too quiet. There were no people in the streets, no sign of life. But then I heard a sound that made me freeze. The door creaking open. I ducked behind a stack of crates and waited, my breath shallow and controlled. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a figure, an old woman, bent over, carrying a basket of what looked like laundry. She didn't seem to notice me at first, but then she stopped. Her head turned slowly, as if she heard something. Her eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, I thought she was going to scream. But she didn't. She didn't say a word. She simply nodded, almost imperceptibly, and then turned, walking back into the house, leaving the door slightly ajar. I didn't move for a long time, trying to process what had just happened. Was she helping me? Was she signaling that it was safe to approach? Or was this some kind of trap? I couldn't afford to take chances, but I couldn't ignore the possibility either. Slowly, cautiously, I made my way toward the door. Each step felt like it took an eternity, but my instincts told me I had to trust her. When I reached the door, I pushed it open just a crack, enough to slip inside without making a sound. The room was dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of fresh bread. And there, standing by the stove, was the old woman. She turned to me with a smile, her face lined with age and hardship, but there was no fear in her eyes. "Bienvenue," she whispered softly. "Welcome." I didn't speak, but I followed her inside. In that moment, I wasn't a soldier anymore. I wasn't just running or hiding. I was someone who had been given a second chance. But even as I crossed the threshold, I knew that this too wouldn't last. The Germans were still out there, and the hunt would never stop. The door closed behind me with a soft, almost reverent sound. The air inside the old woman's house was warm, thick with the aroma of fresh bread and something earthy that I couldn't quite place. The walls were lined with old wooden beams, and the hearth crackled softly in the corner, a small fire flickering away, offering some comfort to my tired bones. The woman, who had simply called herself Marie, gestured for me to sit at a small worn table in the center of the room. She didn't ask questions, she didn't need to. The uniform, the dirt on my face, and the exhaustion in my eyes said everything. I sat, barely able to keep my head upright. Every muscle in my body ached, my back stiff from days of running and hiding. I had no idea how long it would take for the Germans to come looking for me, but the nagging thought that they were already on my trail kept my mind from settling. Still, I had to rest. I had no other choice. Marie didn't speak for a long time. She simply moved about her kitchen, preparing something with the same quiet efficiency that had kept her alive through years of occupation. The quiet was unnerving in a way, like a storm that you could feel building just on the horizon, but I had no energy left to dwell on it. The warmth of the room began to lull me into a half-sleep, and my eyes closed involuntarily. When I woke, there was a small bowl of soup in front of me, the steam rising in gentle curls. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make my stomach growl loudly. I took a spoonful and let the warmth spread through me, the simple nourishment a stark contrast to the cold, harsh reality I had been living for the past few days. As I ate, Marie sat across from me, watching with the same unreadable expression she'd had since I arrived. "How long have you been hiding?" I asked her, finally breaking the silence. My voice was rough and used. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked down at her hands, worn and weathered from years of hard work. It was clear that every line on her face told a story of survival, of loss, and of sacrifice. "Too long," she said, her voice low and almost too soft to hear. "We have lost much. Our village is not the same. We were once free. Now we hide." I nodded, understanding more than she knew. I didn't need to hear the full story. I had seen enough of war to know that freedom, once lost, is not so easily regained. The small piece of safety Marie had given me, this warmth, this moment of peace, was more valuable than any military victory could be. But the weight of it all was heavy on her as much as it was on me. As I ate, the quiet between us deepened. Neither of us wanted to say what was left unsaid. The Germans were close, and time was running out. I finished the soup and stood, my legs a little steadier, though my mind still scrambled with the knowledge that I was on borrowed time. The back door to the house was slightly open, slight draft moving through the room. Marie's eyes flickered to it, then back to me, a silent understanding passing between us. "Where will you go?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. I looked out the small window, past the well-worn tools of her life, and into the distant hills. I had no clear answer. I couldn't afford to make plans, not with the Germans so close. I could feel them closing in, their patrols moving ever closer to the village. If I stayed too long, they'd find me. Anne-Marie, she'd be caught in the crossfire. "I'll go," I said quietly. "But you should leave too. They'll come for you." Marie shook her head, but the sadness in her eyes was evident. "I will stay here. This is my home. And you are not the first soldier to hide here." I couldn't argue with that. In a strange way, I understood her decision. It wasn't about bravery. It was about survival, about holding on to what little they had left. I could see that now clearer than before. I'd seen too many men lose everything in this war, and somehow Marie had found a way to hold on to something that mattered. I wanted to tell her to come with me, to run, but I knew she wouldn't. She couldn't. Her place was here. With one last look at her, I grabbed my pack and moved to the back door, slipping out into the cool evening. The world was still and quiet, too quiet. The stars were barely visible through the thick clouds, and the only sound was the rustle of leaves as the wind blew through the trees. I moved swiftly, carefully, every step measured, every breath held in check. The village behind me seemed almost normal now, too peaceful. It felt wrong, like something was waiting to be broken. I had no idea where I was going. All I knew was that I couldn't stay there. The Germans were coming, and I couldn't let Marie face them alone. But as I moved through the trees, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I slowed my pace, trying to quiet my footsteps, but the sensation only grew stronger. I wasn't alone. Then I heard it, the unmistakable crunch of boots on the gravel road. I wasn't fast enough. It was a distant sound at first, barely perceptible, like a faint drumbeat on the edge of my hearing. But it grew louder with each passing second, until it was all I could focus on. The unmistakable sound of German boots marching on the hard earth, coming closer, closer still. My heart started to pound in my chest, and my legs, still sore from days of running, felt like lead. There was no time to think. I had to move. I darted into the trees, heart racing, breath coming in sharp gasps. The patrol was too close now. I could hear their voices, low, clipped, but unmistakable. The unmistakable rasp of their commands. I ducked behind a thick cluster of bushes, hoping against hope that they wouldn't see me. I wasn't sure if it was luck or skill, but they passed right by me, their boots thudding on the earth just yards away. I held my breath, willing myself to be invisible. The seconds stretched into minutes, and then, when the sound of their footsteps faded into the distance, I let out a slow, shaky breath. But I didn't dare move. Not yet. The night seemed to stretch on forever as I crouched there, waiting. I was exhausted, my body aching for rest, but I couldn't afford to let my guard down. The Germans were still out there, and I was running out of time. I didn't know where to go next. My only hope was that I could make it to the resistance. I had no idea where they were hiding, but I had to find them. Somehow, I couldn't shake the thought that I wasn't just running from the enemy. I was running from something else, something far more dangerous. The past was catching up with me, and I wasn't sure I'd survive it.